In this lesson, we're going to explore the power of blending modes. While most of our digital painting process will be hand-painted, blending modes offer us a lot of control and allow us to make adjustments to our image without having to repaint things from scratch. Understanding blending modes can really open up your process options, and a lot of artists prefer to paint completely with blending modes. So let's see what they do and explore how we can use them to our advantage. As we've seen in previous lessons, blending modes can be applied to both layers and brushes, which is helpful depending on what you're trying to achieve. To apply a blending mode to a layer, simply click the drop-down box at the top of the Layers palette and choose the blending mode you want. To apply a blending mode to your brush tool, click the drop-down box in the tool settings at the top of the screen. Note that blending modes applied to brushes will only affect existing pixels on your currently selected layer. Painting over transparency will act like normal. For instance, if I set my brush to multiply, I can darken the rectangle on this layer by painting with a light blue color. But if I paint beyond the rectangle onto the transparent parts of the layer, the light blue appears like normal pixels. When painting directly with blending modes, it's a good idea to lock your layer's transparency first. On the other hand, if I make a new layer and set it to multiply, I can paint wherever I want and it will always darken the pixels underneath. Now that we know how to access and apply our blending modes, let's take a look at each mode in depth to see what they do and understand how they can be useful to us. Normal is pure pixel data. The color you paint is the color that appears on the layer. This will be your standard mode for digital painting, and all layers are set to normal by default. Dissolve functions much like normal, but it will convert transparency in your brush to a dithered pixelation effect. Personally, I don't use this one much, but it could be useful in certain situations. A useful thing about Photoshop's blending modes is that they're separated into categories by a horizontal line in the drop-down box. So each mode in each category will generally do the same thing with some minor differences. The first category after the default modes is darkening modes, which will always darken pixels in some way. Darken, as the name suggests, will darken other colors down to the value of the color you paint with. For example, if you paint with a color at 50% value, it will darken all values above 50% down to 50%, while leaving values below 50% untouched. This is useful for subduing any light values that have gone too bright without affecting your shadows. Multiply darkens all other colors based on your selected color. The amount of darkening is based on the value you're painting with. Painting with a lighter color will darken less, while painting with a darker color will darken more. So for a subtle effect, paint with light values. For a stronger effect, paint with darker values. Multiply is great for darkening things, adding color, and also for adding dark patterns in tattoos. Color burn functions similarly to multiply but is more intense. It adds more color and is more strongly affected by contrast. Linear burn functions similarly to color burn, but is less affected by contrast. Darker color functions similarly to darken, but it's more picky about which values it affects. Personally, I would always just use darken. The next category is lightening modes, which are basically the opposite of the darkening modes we just looked at. So once you get the hang of one, it's pretty easy to understand the other. Lighten is the opposite of darken. This will lighten other colors up to the value of the color that you paint with. If you paint with a color at 50% value, it will lighten all values below 50% up to 50%, while leaving values above 50% untouched. This is great for brightening shadows without affecting your lights, and also a great trick to add subsurface scattering. Screen is the opposite of multiply. This will lighten all other colors based on the color you paint with, and also add some of that color to them. The amount of lightening is based on the value you're painting with, so for a subtle effect, paint with darker values, and for a stronger effect, paint with lighter values. Screen is a great mode for adding subtle glows, or for removing a black background from an image texture. Color dodge is the opposite of color burn. This functions similarly to screen, but is more intense.
Color dodge!
It adds more color and is more strongly affected by contrast. Color dodge is great for adding glow effects. Linear dodge is the opposite of linear burn. It functions similarly to color dodge, but is less affected by contrast. Personally, I prefer linear dodge to color dodge as I find its effects are more predictable and easy to control. A technique I like to use is to set both my layer and my brush to linear dodge. Then I can paint repeated brush strokes to gradually build up the color and intensity of the glow. Lighter color is the opposite of darker color. It functions a lot like lighten, but again is more picky about which values it affects. For me personally, I find lighten to be more useful for painting. The next category of modes act like a combination of the previous two categories, allowing you to both lighten and darken values depending on the value that you paint with. These modes will also infuse some of the color you're painting with onto existing pixels, allowing you to make some really quick and easy adjustments to your painting. Overlay is like a hybrid multiply screen layer that changes depending on which value you're painting with. If you paint with a value below 50%, it will darken and add color to those pixels. If you paint with a value above 50%, it will lighten and add color to those pixels. At a value of exactly 50%, it will only add color and not change the values. Overlay is great if you want to subtly push your values and colors in a particular direction. Soft light functions similarly to overlay, but is significantly more subtle, whereas hard light is also like overlay, but is significantly more intense. Hard light can also be great for adding glow effects, and it has a different feel than dodge modes. Vivid light is also like overlay, but is extremely intense, like a hybrid color burn color dodge layer. It lightens and darkens areas by adjusting the contrast. Linear light is very similar, but it adjusts values by controlling brightness rather than contrast. Pin light is like a more intense lighten layer. It will only ever lighten pixels, and it adds color and contrast like a dodge layer. Hard mix is also like overlay, but it's so intense that I rarely find it useful for painting. As you've probably noticed, a lot of the individual blending modes in these categories function pretty similarly with some minor differences. It's not important to understand the exact math or logic behind how these blending modes work. It's more important to just experiment with them and find the ones that feel good to you. Every painting is different, so choosing the right blending mode for a particular task is a matter of taste and experience. Inversion modes are the most unique category and do some pretty crazy things. In most cases, they're not super useful for painting, but they can be handy for creating some interesting special effects and post-processing. Difference compares the pixels on the difference layer with the pixels below it, and will invert them based on their color interaction. Fun fact, you can use this blending mode to cheat at those Find the Difference picture games and impress your friends.
Yay!
If your friends are a bunch of 8-year-olds, that is. Exclusion is similar to difference, but less intense. Subtract inverts and darkens colors, while divide inverts and brightens colors. These inversion modes are all pretty wonky, and you won't really need them for painting, but they can be fun to play with to get some psychedelic post-processing effects. For example, I can make a difference layer above my painting, fill it with a color, then press Shift, Ctrl, Alt, and E to make a new layer out of all visible layers. I can then turn off the difference layer and set my new layer to color dodge to get some wacky effects. Transforming this new layer creates even more chaos. Lastly, color modes are a useful category of modes that allow you to adjust the colors in your painting without damaging the rendering. It can be a little tricky to pull this off convincingly, but we'll explore some advanced techniques and show how to use them well later. Hue, saturation, color, and luminosity all function very similarly to each other. They will affect one aspect of your color and adjust other pixels to match whatever you're painting with. So for instance, if you want to change the hue, you can paint with the hue blending mode. If you want to just change the saturation without affecting the color or the value, paint with saturation. If you want to change the color without changing the value, you can use color. And if you want to change the value without changing the color, you can use luminosity. For this assignment, try experimenting with blending modes and see what they can do. You could try to colorize your grayscale painting from the previous assignment, or you could start a new painting and use blending modes to speed up your process. I'll be doing a demo to show you some of the techniques I like to use, but do some experimenting on your own too and get a feel for the blending modes that work best for you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.